Hey guys, what's up? It's Ripe again, back with more Just Know HOA stories. The Homeowner Association title story starts like this. I could be considered lucky because growing up I got to see the best of both a rural life and a more urban one. When I was around 4 years old, my parents got divorced and I stayed living in the city with my mother. My father decided to move back to where he grew up and help my grandfather run his farm. Whenever it was a weekend or holiday that I spent with my dad, I would always enjoy seeing the farm and running around to explore. I was more used to the city life, so having big open fields and tons of animals around was amazing. My grandfather was an incredible man too, and always took time away when I would visit to spend with me. Running a farm is kind of a 24/7 job, so looking back and realizing how much time he gave to hanging out with me was sweet. He taught me how to do a lot of things on the farm, like riding horses, milking cows, and how plants grew. A few times I even spent the entire summer helping on the farm and enjoying the slower-paced area. Now, my dad passed away when I was 11, but that was not the end of me visiting the farm. My grandpa took over as the main male role model in my life. I would still spend weekends and some holidays with him well into my late teenage years and my early 20s. Of course, when I went off to college and started a life of my own, I was spread thinner and visited a lot less. I got a job in my own apartment in the city, so visits turned to phone calls for the most part. One day my mother called me crying to tell me that my grandfather had passed away. Despite being the father of her ex-husband, my mother was also close to him. It was devastating for all of us, and I made sure to take the time off for his funeral. I did not know how many people in that small town knew and loved him until I saw them all at that day to mourn him. It felt comforting in a way to know that even when I was not around, he was surrounded by other people that cared about him. I also found out that my grandfather had a will and he had left me the farm in it. I was his only grandchild, but I was still amazed that he put the farm in my name. I had to make a decision if I was gonna choose to stay in the city or fully move out and run a farm. It was hard because I really do like both of the environments. At the end, I picked to take over the farm and keep it in the family for as long as possible. I was not able to move out with the snap of my fingers or anything. I still had to finish my apartment lease and properly quit my job. My grandfather had farm hands that started helping him take care of things in his older years. I kept them on for the time being and occasionally checked in on the farm to pay them for their work. I was finally out of my lease and could move to the farm fully, but was totally blindsided by this homeowner association. Despite being a rural area, there was an HOA that I did not know that much about. My grandpa complained about them a lot, but he complained about many things, to be honest. I always assumed the HOA was just one of those things that I didn't actually have to pay attention to them. I was making sure that the HOA dues were paid because I've been around the internet long enough to know that not doing so could start a huge fight. However, who knew that they were going to be the ones to actually start a fight with me? About a week or so before I was gonna move in, I got a call from the guys that take care of the farm for me. According to them, they could not get to the barn or fields anymore because I must have forgotten to give or leave them a key for the fence gate. Since there was not a fence or a gate before, and I'm sure I didn't have one put in without remembering, I was deeply confused. I asked them to send me a picture of what they were talking about since I really couldn't believe it. The picture came through and there was really a fence around my farm, and the only way in was unlocking a large gate. I called the HOA because honestly I didn't know what else to do. It did not seem like a matter for the police at the moment. I figured that I paid the HOA anyway, so I might as well get something from them. One of the men actually used a truck to jump over the fence so he could at very least feed the animals. However, he could not let anybody else in though because it was a padlock type of thing, so a key was needed no matter what side they were on. Anyway, I called the HOA and after being put on hold for what felt like a way too long, I got through to somebody. HOA, hello? Me, hi, I'm calling about the farm at XYZ address. My workers called saying that they couldn't get in because somebody put a fence around it. HOA, and, well, I didn't put a fence around it. Somebody is blocking me from entering my property and I want to know if there's something you can do to help. HOA, what did you say your name was again? Me, it's OP. HOA, we know who owns property around here and you clearly don't. I tried to explain that the property belonged to my grandfather who died and it was left to me, so maybe their records of who owned it were not updated yet or something. Still, they were adamant about me not owning the property, and after going back and forth for 10 minutes, they hit me with this. HOA? Sir, that property belongs to the HOA and no one else. We were the ones that put the fence around it, and I can have you arrested for admitting that you were the one trespassing on it. If you try to enter this property or have anybody else enter it again, I'm gonna make sure that you end up in jail. The person hung up on me and I was both furious and dazed. I never had a conversation like that in my life before and felt like I must have been dreaming. I knew that I was gonna have to fight them about this entire thing. They were claiming the farm belonged to them and I had no course of action against them except for suing them. Again, I've been around the internet long enough to know that the only thing to do when the HOA was going after you was to sue them and fight them in court. My biggest issue was that lawsuits take a long time, and while I didn't have any qualms about waiting for things to get sorted out, the animals did. I had to make sure that while all of this was going on, at least somebody was allowed onto the property to take care of the animals. When I called my lawyer, I made it very clear that the fence they had created stopped anybody from caring for the animals. He told me that while he would try to talk to a judge as soon as the lawsuit was filed, it might still take some time. The best course of action was to talk to the head of police and explain the situation. He had to, of course, get the head of the HOA involved in order to find an immediate solution for the animals while the courts did its slow process. The only downside was that the HOA had got some advance notice about being sued, but the animals were more important, of course. After a ton of fighting and them claiming the barn was empty and no animals existed, we came to an agreement. The police insisted they be allowed to check the property to see if animals were currently residing on the farm, which they were on. Then he gave the homeowner association two options. They could agree to have the animals relocated until the courts along with the farm confirmed ownership. Or they could allow a third party access to the property for the sole purpose of taking care of them. And I was willing to pay for that since I already was and I knew they were mine. They then agreed to the second option and one of the farmhands was given the key with instructions not to give it to me and not to do anything except take care of the animals. About a week later, the judge decided that because animals were involved, he would make an order before any kind of hearing or trial. That a new lock be put on the fence and the farmhand given the key. Neither side could use or enter the property until a final ruling was made. So I was still stuck living in the city and communicating from there while the HOA had a front row seat. Still, I was planning on destroying them and making sure I got my farm back. It took a while, but we finally had a meeting where we were both with our lawyers in a room and there were some other people in the room as well. I don't know exactly all of their specific roles, but I guess they made it official. My lawyer was upfront and stated that I owned the property and the HOA should immediately back off. If they did, I was willing to forego any further legal action on the matter. Basically, if they gave up right then and there, I would have dropped everything on my end. However, they refused to come to any agreement that wasn't me just letting them have the farm. If you wonder why the will and the deed were not enough, it was because the HOA had their own fake paperwork. They claim that when my grandfather was alive, he signed papers that state that the property would not be inherited to anyone and so he would donate the land to the HOA after his death since they owned it before he did. This was an outright lie since I believe his father owned the property before him. I had no proof on that though, so we didn't really try and argue against that too hard as our legal plan. Either way, they were claiming that the will was fake or that their paperwork was more valid or something. They wanted to take it all the way to court, which meant more waiting. Keep in mind that I already quit my job and gave up the lease on my apartment, so I was back living with my mom and not working. Instead of just doing research on these laws and working on my case until it seemed unbeatable. When we went to court, the lawyers did most of the talking and I was just asked a few simple questions. Confirming who I was and that I did not touch or alter my grandfather's will. All of the boring stuff that I had answered for people about 1,000 times at this point. The head of the HOA then started talking about how the HOA being donated land was an essential and vital part of the neighborhood. That my grandfather was a great man and would have loved to do that for his community. So then they could use the land to build structures that would help everybody as a whole, trying to mark me as some greedy city guy instead of a person that spent half his time growing up on that very same farm. Now the HOA lawyers must have spent most of their time trying to prove that the paperwork they had was not forged. And that my grandfather leaving it to them on a certain date meant that it overrode whatever he put in the actual will. They even told the court that they were willing to make amends by letting me keep a small portion of the land. My lawyer and I were not even trying to argue if their paperwork was or was not forged. Instead, we were arguing that it was not even legal to begin with. My lawyer pulled up a list of properties that, when digging, are owned by the HOA. All of those gotten by using the same kind of forms that they claimed my grandfather signed. Each one of those properties was not paying any kind of tax because it was being used as a home. It was being used as a community space, and yet each and every property was getting mail delivered to in the names of different HOA board members. Going to the properties would reveal a house that was clearly being lived in. On top of that, no other property existed in the names of any HOA members. They all had a PO box instead of an actual address. They were using this method of stealing properties in order to live and avoid paying certain taxes because of it. According to their taxes and government records, they did not have a home, so how could they be expected to pay anything on them? Well, legally they did have addresses, but it was all for homes that elderly relatives lived in and that they were clearly just pretending to be staying at. The entire case got a lot more interesting once that piece of information had been opened up. For a long time we were trying to find something solid about the documents themselves being illegal or not valid. Donating land, though, is something people can do, and going down that route did not get us anywhere. So instead we were claiming that the forms were indeed all fake and they were forging them in order to live on a property while claiming it was community space. It also did not help them that many members of the community claimed that my grandfather spoke badly of the HOA in public. Also talked about me all the time and how he knew that once he passed away, I would look after the farm. The controversy mixed with the testimony was enough for a judge to agree that what he wrote in his will was valid and the paperwork the HOA had was forged. Of course, that was not the end of what happened to them though. What I was doing was a civil case, but now that they had basically been caught doing fraud on a federal level, they were getting arrested. Then they were going to criminal court and through that entire process. My part was done though, and the judge ordered the fence to be removed fully and I be allowed to finally move into my family farm. I was relieved that the entire thing was over and I could start this new chapter in my life. The one where I get to make my grandfather proud and all of that good stuff. I will say one thing for sure, I was glad to be able to see the animals again. Some of the cows and horses I have known for years and had bonds with. Being in the town also meant that I had a front row seat to hear everything that was gonna happen with the HOA. The board members all confessed to living in the homes while claiming otherwise, and they also admitted to at least some of the paperwork being forged and the next of kin not even attempting to be contacted. They were clearly targeting people they didn't think had family and might not even have a will. I was not around enough for them to notice, I guess, and assumed my grandfather had nobody. They all went to jail and the next of kin for the properties were all contacted. They had the option to sell the properties or let it be properly donated. Since they heard about what happened, most of them were too worried about history repeating itself if they donated the land. Some really did have no next of kin and the brand new HOA was responsible for the land. This one was made up of better people, or more scared ones, and they used the property for what it was meant for and built a community center for people, as well as an area where people could sell goods like a small farmer's market. I'm glad that I agreed to take the property because if I didn't, I hate to think what the corrupt HOA would have done with it. And yeah, Ripe Stars, I am glad that OP came out on top of it in the end and that the evil HOA members finally ended up behind bars. That is exactly where entitled evil HOA douchebags belong, if you ask me. Either way, guys, I was thinking while reading this story and all the other farm HOA stories as well, that I really need to replay either Harvest Moon or Stardew Valley, which is one of my favorite games. Have you ever played any of these farming games? And if you did, which one is your favorite? Let me know in the comments, and while you're at it, please don't forget to like the video and maybe even post a comment if you want to support me. And the next one is titled "The Neighbor Went Too Far." I live in an apartment complex and the parking lot has a terrible entrance. In order to exit the parking lot, you have to traverse a small tunnel about 4 to 5 meters long and a car is barely able to pass through the tunnel. A tow truck definitely can't. A couple of days ago, my neighbor came to knock at my door. I barely know him, but he seemed like a kind person the few times I talked to him. He told me his car was broken and asked if I could help him bring it to the other side of the tunnel so that a tow truck could come and pick it up. I said sure. My cousin husband was with me at the time, so he came to help too. We pushed the car until the end of the tunnel and left it on the side of the road in a point where the road gets larger. The neighbor thanked us and we parted ways. The next day his wife came to knock at my door. She initially thanked us for helping her husband, but then she started scolding us when she found out that we left her husband alone. Apparently the man suffered a heart stroke a few weeks ago and he is not supposed to be left alone for prolonged periods of time. I did not know this, of course. He looked like a healthy man in his late 40s and he said nothing to us. We explained this to her and she said that even if we didn't know that, we should have stayed with him. What if the tow truck had problems picking up the car? What if he had to move the car again? I tried discussing with her for a few minutes, but to be sincere, I had no strength to argue, so I simply said I was sorry and dropped the whole thing. Now I'm curious though. So Reddit, am I the jerk for leaving the man alone there and not waiting for the tow truck to arrive? And yeah, Ripe stars, in my opinion, obviously OP is not the a-hole here, since he is not the babysitter of a 40-plus-year-old man. If this woman is so worried about her husband, why didn't she just stay with him then? Doesn't make any sense to me. Please let me know what you think about this in the comments. And someone on Reddit said, not the a-hole, you did not know and had no reason to assume this person didn't have access to a phone or help from other people. Comment number 2, not the a-hole, if he shouldn't be alone for long periods of time, then where was his wife? The guy had to come and knock on your door after all. And yeah, obviously I would 100% agree with Reddit here. There's no reason why OP would be the a-hole in this situation. Neighbors stole my classic car, I got their kids taken away. Don't mess with my business. I own a car dealership business which I run out of a normal kind of lot. The only thing is that I worry about the security, so when I get a car that is going to get a big price tag attached to it, I tend to store it in my home. If somebody wants to buy or test drive them, I bring the car to the lot that day and go from there. At the moment the story is taking place, I only had one car for sale that I felt was safer in my garage than in the lot. It was a classic car, and for anybody super curious, it was a 1969 Corvette L88 convertible. This car was worth a little over $500,000, and until some collector wanted to spend the money on it, I was keeping it locked in my garage. I know that seemed like a lot of backstory, but I promise I'm almost done once I talk about the neighbors that live next door to me. I don't know too much about them, but they have lived next to me for many years and always seemed okay. The situation was that I was at home with my kids while my wife went to do some grocery shopping and various other errands. I get a call that she was in a small crash and being taken to the hospital just in case. For anybody wondering, she was totally fine and I was the one freaking out more, wanting to go meet her there. At first I was going to try and take the kids with me because I could not think of any other option. When I saw the neighbor though and she questioned my panic, I explained to her what was going on. She offered to babysit the kids for a couple of hours while I went and got things sorted out. I knew she had kids of her own, so I figured, what the heck, it will be fine. I let her into my house and fished out all the cash from my wallet, telling her she could order in for her and the kids if they all start to get hungry. When I got home with my wife, neighbor was pretty quick to leave the house and go back to hers. I did not think anything strange of it because she probably had to get her own kids to bed. It was not until everything was settled and I went to do the dishes that I even noticed something was wrong in the first place. The kitchen has a door that connects to the garage and I noticed that it looked like somebody had taken an axe to it. The door has a special lock that I always have on me so that nobody can scope out my garage and see the cars I have in there. I could not believe what I was seeing, and it was like one of those images where the more you look, the more wrong things you see. Most importantly, the car was gone, but I will get back to that in just a second. The garage door itself needs a code to open, and since they did not know it, they used something to brute force their way through that as well. I was furious and wanted to go stomp over and start screaming at her to give me my car back right now. My wife was resting and the kids were asleep since I got there, and I was also barely awake. I figured that it could wait till the morning to get to the bottom of this, so instead I sent her husband a text asking what the hell they did with my car. I woke up to no answer, but what nobody noticed was that I have a camera set up in the garage. I mean, if I'm going to have locks and codes, a camera just makes sense. What all of us are thinking happens is what did, and they got an axe from their house presumably and broke down the door to see what was in the garage. Then I saw them go out of frame and the garage door being destroyed. Finally, the husband got into the classic car and started driving it away while the wife went back into the house. There was no audio, but I know my kids and can guarantee they were screaming in the background from all of that noise. Also, the probably $100 I left for a pizza was just totally gone, but I had bigger fish to fry. The neighbors were still totally ignoring every attempt for me to get in contact with them and instead were holed up inside of their house. I would guess at least because I could hear their kids screaming and I saw their car was still parked in the front. I was going to be nice and give them a chance to do this the easy way and give it back, but now that option was totally out the window and they were going to pay. Grand Theft Auto, while a crime in itself, is also dependent on what you steal. A car worth that much is a felony where I live and they were potentially going to end up in jail. I went to the police station with the video and telling them about the car and exactly what happened. It did not take long for them to get a warrant out for the neighbors to be arrested. Normally a story would end here with me getting the car back and them having to pay for the damage and go to jail, but actually it gets a little bit more interesting than that. It turns out that this was not the first time the neighbors had been arrested for theft. They were actually currently on probation for previous crimes, and since they did not want to leave the house and see me, they both missed an appointment with their probation officer, which gets them in even more trouble. It turns out that these two were notorious petty thieves and seen on no less than 10 security cameras and just not been identified yet. So, while the case for my car was going on, they were now also caught for various other crimes of theft that were smaller in nature. So they went to jail, and I cannot really say for sure if it was because of them stealing my car. If they were never in trouble before, they might have gotten off with probation. All of these things combined though, there really was no other option but to send them to jail for the crimes they committed. The best bit though was when we were bringing up my car to them in court and the wife tried to argue that while all the other stuff was in fact stolen, the car from me wasn't. She tried to come up with some story about how since she babysat my kids and I did not pay her, I agreed to let her take and use the car for a while instead. It was the dumbest story and they cut her off before she could continue to ramble about it. A few weeks later though, the car got sold and I am making sure my garage is even more secure before I end up with another expensive car to protect. As for her kids, they ended up going to live with their grandparents because the parents also lost custody since they were going to jail. I don't feel too bad about it though, because having those kinds of parents as role models, they might have ended up as criminals themselves. At least now they might have a chance to be taught right from wrong. And yeah, Ripe Stars, I gotta say, recently we have quite a few stories about expensive cars getting stolen, and it seems like cars especially make some people really jealous. And I suppose some entitled folks feel like they must also have such a car, because that is why they just take it from a neighbor. Anyway, if you enjoy the stories about crazy neighbors, then I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and maybe even like the video. Thank you so much in advance.